James Wright Festival, the 29th. Woo! Yeah, wow. Unbelievable. I want to thank a few people. Like Anthony Orsini, the librarian who has been putting up with us and has done. Wow.
Here he is coming in right now.
Anthony!
Yay!
And all of his staff. I mean, if you went out to the main room, the former every year they had a T-shirt. We don't have a T-shirt. We're sorry. This year.
That's good.
We didn't get it together enough. But check out those T-shirts; they're amazing, and the display cases and all of James Wright's books are over there. The original book, the original Branch Will Not Break, and the original St. Judas. Wow, so fantastic! What a one! And it's Library Week this week, and it's Poetry Month. So there you go. I also want to thank the Eastern Ohio Arts Council, especially who couldn't make it. Brianna Dance, who is a representative for Belmont County, who was amazing in getting us funding to start this thing and to do it. So, Eastern Ohio Arts Council, the Belmont County Tourist Bureau, which was equally amazing. I couldn't believe how generous they were. The Martin's Ferry, believe it or not, Historical Society, including Thomas and his wife Rosie Thomas, who showed David Zwerlo and I around anywhere we wanted to go to prepare for the tour that we're hoping to do later on. That I hope nobody gets lost. We also, of course, want Jackie Pugh is the person at the Belmont Ferry, the Belmont County Tourist Bureau. Also, most especially, want to thank Annie Wright, who couldn't make it, but her works will be shared. Especially, we want to give a real shout out to the person who has been so responsible for all the festivals so far, Tom Flynn. So please give when Swerdlow and Newman and I had this crazy idea, we said, we better talk to Tom Flynn first to get it kosher. And he said, yeah, and because we didn't want to step on anybody's toes. Here we are, three, schmagaggies from Western Pennsylvania with Ohioans. And we thought, let's talk to Tom Flynn. He'll know. And he did. And he was so supportive and enthusiastic. And without that, this wouldn't be happening. And it wouldn't have been happening over the years. So thank you, Tom. We really appreciate it. Okay. Did I thank everybody? David? I want to thank you for being here, everybody. I definitely, especially, want to thank Jonathan Blunk, who many of you know. Wow, this book is incredible. I just want to say the obvious. He's the author of James Wright, A Life in Poetry, the authorized biography of the poet. He assisted also in editing, and it's also equally as complete and as large and as wonderful. The letters, selected letters of James Wright, which is a phenomenal book with Jonathan Blunk, gave great assistance on. Praise for the biography has been universal. Gerald Stern, who's been one, if you looked at a little so-called program I tried to create, on the back it has all the poets that have been here since 1981. You just, the greatest American poets you can think of, Robert Bly, Galway Connell, David Matto, Gerald Stern. You just, Stanley Kudis, you think about it and they've been here. Praise for the biography has been universal. Gerald Stern has said Blunk's biography of James Wright is as good as it gets. Edward Hirsch also agreed that the biography tells the full story of a representative and necessary American maker. It is a stunning achievement. And the New York Times said the literary biography is at its fine-grained finest. Fine-grained finest, I like that phrase. So, yeah, I totally agree. I mean, sometimes you read biographies of writers, and you don't want this writer to, well, you never want the writer to pass away because the book will end, And that's the kind of biography this is. It's so engaging, it's so informative. The last 100 pages are notes. that he said he snuck in the back. And so 100 pages of notes. The research is impeccable. And there's some for sale back there. I highly recommend it. But he's not just a biographer of James Wright. Graduate of Warren Wilson MFA program for writers. He's published his own poems. He's also a bass player. He plays the stand-up bass and the electric bass. I tried to convince him to bring the bass with him. He's going to music later, but he shied away from it. He's also an expert on jazz as well as reggae. He's got many, many skills and many, many talents. For the past 3 decades, Jonathan's worked as a literary editor and legal proofreader and has broad experience with name branding and independent audio production projects. So, and his research for this book draws on more than 300 hours of interviews and archival sources. So if you want to know anything about James Wright, just read it. This brings you also back to the poetry, which is amazing. So, without any further gabbing from me, John Blunk.
What a great pleasure to be here. It's wonderful to see you all. Thank everyone for coming to Martin's Ferry. I've been here many times before, but it's been since 2018 when the biography was published was the last time I was here. What is that doing? Okay. Yes, thank you, Anthony Orsini, for hosting us in the library. And is that better? And Philip Terman, David Swerdlow, and Dave Newman. This came together very, very quickly when it appeared that money was available to make this happen. And so a lot of things happened because of these 3 gentlemen and their rather crazy idea of another James Wright Festival in Martin's Ferry. And I've been wondering what brings us all here. I can't think of another festival that's dedicated to an American poet. For 27 consecutive years we met here at the library and local environs for the festival. And James Wright is unique in many ways. This one perhaps the most public of ways. Certainly many of the greatest poets in America came here after Wright's death in March of 1980, every spring to celebrate his poetry. That's over 43 years ago that he passed away. And yet here we are. Of course, it's the poems. There is an enduring abundance, I feel, in Wright's poems. And I think part of that is a gift of storytelling. I was thinking one of the great strengths, even in the imagistic poems that you find in The Branch Will Not Break, there's still a kernel or a seed of narrative that's about our emotional life is embedded in these poems. And this gift of storytelling, that's just one part of his great gift. He sometimes maligned his Irish gift for gab, and it was a talent he claimed from his mother. That was the Lyons side of the family. Jessie, his mother, was a storyteller of great renown, but he cautioned himself against this because it led him into glibness. But I think Wright is always telling a story, and it's grounded in feeling and it's grounded in place. And that's one reason we find ourselves here, I think, in Martin's Ferry. It's endlessly fascinating to me how Wright can be talking about this particular place, Martin's Ferry, but our experience of the poem is often grounded in our own intimate knowledge of the places that we have lived and our own emotional life and our place in the world. This is part of what brings us here, I think, and wanting to know more about Wright's life and the raw materials of his alchemy. It is our very human curiosity about how the magician does his tricks. Perhaps it's how his voice has gotten inside our heads in a way, or in our ears. There's an art and precision of observation to his storytelling that is often about this place and the people who live here that he wants to praise, his family and his friends and his neighbors. I'd like to begin by reading a prose piece that appeared in this journey, and on one of the places on the map for this afternoon's tour, if we're so lucky, is Pearl Street. This is a prose piece called Old Bud. Old Bud Romick weighed 300 pounds, if he weighed an ounce, and he weighed an ounce. He used to sit on his front porch swing, enraged and helpless, while his two tiny grandchildren, hilarious and hellish little boys, scampered just out of his reach and yelled hideously, "Hell on you, Grandpa!" His unbelievable Adam's apple purpled and shone like the burl on the root of a white oak, and he sang his goddams in despair. Old Bud Romick has fallen asleep as the twilight comes down Pearl Street in Martins Ferry, Ohio. The window shutters close here and there, and the flowing streetcars glow past into silence, their wicker seats empty, for the factory whistles have all blown down, and the widows have all gone home. Empty, too, are the cinder alleys, smelling of warm summer asphalt. The streetlight columns, faintly golden, fill with the cracked mirrors of June bugs' wings. Old Bud Romick sags, still on the porch swing. The rusty chains do their best for his body in the dark. The dark turns around him, a stain like the bruise on a plum someone somehow missed and left under a leaf. His two hellions have long since giggled their way upstairs. Old Bud Romick is talking lightly in his sleep, and an evening shower brings him a sticky new sycamore leaf in his sleep. Whether or not he is aware of leaves, I don't know. I don't know whether or not he is aware of anything touching his face. Whether or not he dreams of how slender sycamores are, how slender young women are when they walk beneath the trees, without caring how green they are, how lucky a plum might be if it dies without being eaten. I don't know. Yeah, well, I suspect that many of us have come here out of a sense of gratitude for these poems. Certainly I do. We want to know Wright better and honor the enduring exactitude of sensory and emotional experience that he captures in language. He gives us access to our own emotional lives, those complex and intermingled feelings that we struggle to identify and articulate. He often spoke of this same gratitude for the poems and poets who, for a moment, increased his capacity to feel. When I began researching my biography of Wright, I became convinced that I couldn't begin writing without knowing with certainty when the last time Wright had physically set foot in Martins Ferry. I knew that this was an important part of the story. I took encouragement from this belief from a passage in J.D. Salinger's Catcher in the Rye, a book Wright often taught, one he revered and knew many passages by heart. Early in the novel, Holden Caulfield remarks, "I don't care if it's a sad goodbye or a bad goodbye, but when I leave a place, I like to know I'm leaving it. If you don't, you feel even worse." That's how Wright described his feelings about returning to Martins Ferry the last time he was here in December of 1957. 4 days after his 30th birthday, in a letter written in Minneapolis to an old Kenyan classmate. He says, "Tomorrow morning, December 18th, we're driving to Ohio to visit families and revisit the idyllic scenes of childhood. I feel as if I had swallowed rat poison and were irresistibly seeking to quench my thirst at the font of nectar, the Ohio River." The most joy Wright found in his return to Ohio was a visit he made with John Crow Ransom in Gambier. Upon returning to Minneapolis, he wrote to Ransom, "My return to Ohio after many years was, as you know, a return to my childhood. And of course, nearly everything was changed, as I myself was. So many things about Martins Ferry have changed, but the ghosts of the old city are still found walking its streets and on the dirt paths down along the river. I hope many of you can join us this afternoon, hoping all goes well. And one of the hallmarks of Wright's sensibility is, I feel, an expression of generosity, the way that his own gratitude to the poems and the poets he loved becomes infectious, in part because of his extravagant enthusiasms. Poetry is transmitted by one voice to another human being. It is a gift that is passed between us. This is the very nature of poetry. It lives in the sharing of words, and Wright felt an almost evangelical commitment to the poems that mattered deeply to him. For Wright, poetry was the oxygen he needed to breathe, to live more fully, and reading his poems, I have a sense of this quality of nurturance, that I'm getting the food or the oxygen that I need to survive. This is what William Carlos Williams means when he writes near the end of Asphodel, that greeny flower. It is difficult to get the news from poems, yet men die miserably every day for lack of what is found there. Poetry, as I've come to believe as a longtime student of James Wright, is an opportunity to choose the company we keep, a kind of elective kinship. Michael S. Harper, the great African-American poet who revered Wright's work and who traveled here to the festival in 2003, it's 20 years ago, was fond of quoting Ralph Ellison's wise observation: "Some people are your relatives, but others are your ancestors, and you choose the ones you want to have as ancestors. You create yourself out of those values." Wright clearly internalized this understanding and perhaps took it even further. He considered all the great poets in whatever language and whatever period of human history his contemporaries. The supreme masters of the art were the measure by which he weighed his own accomplishments. Wright remarked in his final interview in September of 1979 that one of the distinctive characteristics of recent American poetry, one of the salient shifts of focus, is towards a poetry of place, of this country, much as Williams had called for. And like Paterson, New Jersey, the lack of classical beauty in Martin's Ferry required a poetry that can praise even what is ugly. This is not the romantic model that many of us were taught to think is the only kind of poetry. Wright considered himself a classicist rather than a romantic. Referring to Horace, Wright said, "I'm a traditionalist, and I think that whatever we have in our lives that matters has to do with our discovering our true relation to the past." In this last interview, Wright readily admits his own limitations, but then he's comparing himself to Horace. He speaks with reverence and humility, and I can't help feeling gratitude in response for his passions and for the kinship he claims with poets from every culture and every era. It's not exactly humility, perhaps, to claim the company of Horace, but Wright knows this. He concludes this deeply personal declaration in this interview by saying, again, "I am a traditionalist, and I think that whatever we have in our lives that matters has to do with our discovering our true relation to the past." Wright is referring to the stunning clarity and poise of Horace's Latin and acknowledging how far his own work falls short. But I also hear running underneath this confession a way in which he's speaking about Martin's Ferry, of his childhood and his constant struggle to discover his own true relation to that past. Well, to hear Wright speaking so eloquently about Horace in what were the final months of his life, we owe a debt of gratitude to Miss Sheriff, his Latin teacher at Shreve High School. Wright would have insisted on this, that we give proper acknowledgement. It might seem surprising, but the book of Wright's that has the most direct references to Martin's Ferry is his last book, This Journey. After Wright got sober for good in the last years of his life, he delightedly told his good friend, the poet Roland Flint, who was here in 1997 with Joy Harjo, he told Roland Flint, "My languages are coming back. I'm remembering things I'd forgotten for years." Wright was speaking of the foreign languages he knew, German, Spanish, and Latin. But I think we can also see how a wealth of other languages, the words and dialects and vernacular wisdom he had heard from his earliest childhood, were now also more accessible to his extraordinary memory. But even in many earlier poems, where the struggle with alcoholism is perhaps most in evidence, in the new poems at the end of the collected poems that came out in 1971, or in Two Citizens, which is 1973, Wright's attention is still focused on trying to capture the energy of language and the unique verbal fecundity of Southern Ohioan vernacular speech. In the poems from this time, which Wright himself later admitted were unfinished, lacking a final decisive round of revision, what is often most compelling is the open experimentation Wright is engaged in, trying to capture both a people and a place with specificity. The vernacular expressions, the ways of talking and storytelling that had first ignited his passion for language and his desire to dignify the lives of the people he knew growing up in Martins Ferry, not just his parents and siblings, but his relatives and neighbors. I'm going to read a poem. This is from the new poems that he collected. He considered it a separate book that was being published at the end of the collected poems in 1971. This is called Trouble, and it begins with an epigraph by Judy Holliday, the great Hollywood actress who feigned innocence and was much smarter than everyone else in the room. But Judy Holliday said, "Well, look, honey, where I come from, when a girl says she's in trouble, she's in trouble." Leering across Pearl Street, Crum Anderson yipped, "Hey, Pew, I see your sister been rid bareback. She swallow a watermelon? Fred Gordon, Fred Gordon, Fred Gordon. What do you mean? She can get fat, can't she?" Fat? Willow and lonesome Roberta running alone down Pearl Street in the rain the last time I ever saw her. Smiling a smile Crum Anderson will never know, wondering at her body. 16 years, and all that time she thought she was nothing but skin and bones. I'm still amazed to recall that nearly everyone I spoke to, while researching my biography, could remember the poet so vividly, his physical presence in the room, his astonishing capacity for reciting poetry and prose from memory, the quality of his voice. Almost to a poor person, those I interviewed could share distinct impressions of Wright many decades after his death. I think we have all fallen under the spell of his voice, the undeniable authority that lives on in his work, what the poet John Haig has called, in a marvelous phrase, the impetus, the poet's energy flowing through the forms. Stanley Kunitz, who was here in Martins Ferry twice in 1986 and again for the fabulous 10th Festival in 1990. Stanley Kunitz agreed, praising the manifestation of his spirit, that psychic energy that flowed from Wright and that continues to flow from his poems. One of my primary goals in writing the biography was to capture Wright's voice, to give the reader a strong, clear glimpse of the poet. Early in my research, I began gathering and transcribing audio recordings of Wright's readings and interviews. And in this way, his actual physical voice sounded constantly in my ears. I encourage you to take a look at do we have the video of James Wright's reading? Is that going to be part of?
It's going to be in the back of the library.
Excellent. So it's just going to be on a loop. So if you get a chance to see, or if you go on YouTube, you can. There's only a couple video recordings of the poet available, but to see him physically embodying these poems is I think very important to have a sense of how grounded these poems are. I believe he created an enduring voice in his poems which remain distinctive for their qualities of passionate engagement and human sympathy. He developed an uncanny oral acuity by ear, attuned to the patterns and sounds of human speech. And even as a young child, he listened closely to the voices around him. In this multi-ethnic community of Martins Ferry, he was surrounded by, in his childhood and adolescence, it was like a chorus of different languages. And he said late in his life, "I carry with me today the affections of those words." And that's such a telling remark. There's so much there's so much feeling that he's trying to get across in that brief statement. And he cherished it's like a diversity of music that he could hear. After discovering poetry at the age of 10, he began reciting his own and others' poems to anyone who would listen. And instinctively, Wright understood that poetry lives in the human voice, and his preternatural ability to memorize passages of verse and prose was encouraged again by his high school Latin classes. And all his life, Wright recited Catullus, Horace, and Virgil from memory. During the last month of June, the last June he was alive, during the month of June in his last journey in Italy, it was the period of most extraordinary productivity in his life, really, was the work he was getting done as he and Annie were sequestered on the peninsula of Lake Sirmione that stretches up into Lake Garda. They were there for a month. And Wright was working constantly every day at his typewriter. And in a letter to his childhood friend Tom Hodge, he quotes from memory Catullus's poem On Sirmione, a little poem printed toward the back of Miss Sheriff's old beginner's text in Latin. He's writing a letter to an old friend, and, almost unbidden, this phrase of Catullus's, he transcribes into his letter. We should also thank Elizabeth Willerton, his great English teacher at Shreve High School. Those two women are responsible. I mean, they're why we're here today. As Wright's younger brother Jack told me, it's not just the photographic part of the memory, it's the auditory memory, it seems to me. Because you can't always remember to put the punctuation, but you damn well know where the syllables will go. Listening to Wright recite poems, you can hear the joy that sweeps him up in language and the almost proselytizing energy behind it. He became a kind of St. Paul for every poet whose work consumed him at any given time. Of course, this could change from one moment to the next or from one poem to the next. I wanted to read briefly from a recollection by Paul Carroll, a poet and editor from Chicago who started the Poetry Center. And this is from a period of when before Wright settles in New York City, but he had left Minneapolis, praise God. And this is a short thumbnail sketch of Wright that gives, I think, a good glimpse of him. It never seemed surprising to hear him suddenly talk like a shaman, conjuring that world other than the everyday surface of life, that world where the soul remains in gentleness, rage, lust, cold loneliness, despair, and love, and an abiding awareness of the verities handed down by Homer and the book of Genesis. Certainly you sensed that wretchedness and grandeur when you heard and watched Wright read in public with his electric, all but unbearable intensities, or when you spent time in his company. Few could or perhaps would have wanted to sustain his daily pitch of intensity and his consuming love of poetry in all its shape. He then quotes Robert Bly. This is Robert's words. Deep in Wright's personality is the plower who does not look back. Everyone recognizes this in his work instinctively, and it is probably one reason for the great affection people have for his work. His instinct is to push everything to extremes, to twist away and go farther. It is obvious that out of devotion to poetry, he would leave any job in the world with no notice or live in any way. Early one Sunday morning, this is Paul Carroll again. Early one Sunday morning, Wright was staying with Paul Carroll after this reading. Early one Sunday morning in 1966, after a long, exuberant dinner party in his honor, during which Wright delighted everybody by his spirited recitations from memory of what was literally an anthology of Irish pub and curse songs, American Indian runes, Houseman lyrics, and impersonations of Wilkins Micawber and other Dickensian characters, I was awakened by the sound of his voice reciting aloud to himself in the hallway between his guest room and our bedroom the entire sonnet by Alan Tate. Ah, Christ, I love you rings to the wild sky. I was astonished. It was as if poetry were the air he breathed, the dreams he had dreamt. One aspect of Wright, which only came out in the later work, but which was abundantly evident in the man himself, was an infectious, bubbling, lopsided humor. This is Paul Carroll still, I'm just finishing here. Suddenly, in the midst of a grave conversation about literary politics, say, or Vietnam, Jim, stocky and deadpan, might break into a classic 1930s amateur hour pose declaring, by day, a humble butcher in the Bronx, by night, a fabulous tap dancer, which he would then demonstrate with gusto. So in that same way that I wondered, when was the last time James Wright was in Martin's Ferry? And that's how I knew that I could begin my book. Of course, the first time I thought I knew, I was wrong. But that's just part of the research. But in preparing for this talk, I decided, when was the last time that Martin's Ferry appeared in his poetry? When was the last time he visited the place in his imagination? So I went back to the journals he kept during the last year of his life, and that's a remarkable source for all of the poems that you find, nearly all of them, in this journey. His working journals, he had a daily practice of writing in his journals while they were traveling in Europe. And it's an astonishing collection of raw poetry. And together with Annie, they made this long sojourn from December of 1978 until the first week in September of 1979. More than 8 months of tremendous productivity. And they began their travels in Paris, staying in their treasured retreat, the Higginses' 6th floor apartment, where they had stayed twice before. And one of the first poems that Wright completed from his journal writing, it's a prose piece called Come, Look Quietly. And it's actually placed in the manuscript of this journey immediately before the prose piece I read before called Old Bud. I'm going to, this portion of it, edited very slightly. I'll say this. In this first typed paragraph that becomes this short little prose piece, he underscores in the typed copy of his journal that he underscores "Come, Look Quietly" and scribbles title. Like he immediately saw that this piece stood on its own. But what fascinated me was in his original version, the comma shifts. In the original version, it's "Come look, comma, quietly." And in the published version, "Come, look quietly." It fascinates me. But anyway, "Come, look quietly." The bird on the terrace has his own name in French, but I don't know it. He may be a nuthatch, only he doesn't eat upside down. He has a perfectly round, small purple cap on his crown and a slender, long mask from his ears to his eyes all the way across. Come, look quietly, all the way across Paris. Far behind the bird, the globes of Sacré-Cœur form out of the rain and fade again, all by themselves. The daylight all across the city is taking its own time. The plump Parisian wild bird is scoring a light breakfast at the end of December. He has found the last seeds left in tiny cones on the outcast Christmas tree that blows on the terrace. That's the first paragraph of what is actually a 3-page journal entry that he excised all but that brief little passage, deleting a harsh recollection of standing on the rim of the city dump in Martin's Ferry. It's kind of astonishing. I'm not going to read that piece. It's actually kind of frightening at times. He's speaking of a person he hated desperately. And somehow these pieces, when they first came out into his journal, were all of a piece. But handwritten near the end of that first draft in his journal, he writes, "Stop cursing, find another way." This is the beginning. This is the beginning of his great trip in Europe. Those 9 months. This is the very first week of his work there. So after months of traveling in England and Belgium and Amsterdam, Italy, and France, Wright found himself exhausted without any clear understanding why. But Martin's Ferry, thousands of miles away, continued to appear in his journals. So after that incredibly productive month in June, they continued their travels. Annie's sister had actually joined them, and they went on they rented a car and were driving back to some of their favorite spots in Italy. So I'm going to read two short prose passages from his journal when they were staying in Siena. And some of these prose passages that he's typing, he had a portable typewriter that he traveled with, and he would improvise on the typewriter. I mean, that's one of his skills. He sometimes carried small little journals that he would write by hand, but his daily work in his journal was on a typewriter. So this is in Siena. It is the day of the Palio, the great medieval pageant. And curiously, I have Ohio on my mind and my bitterly heartbreaking cousin Dave, who is dead. He and I snuck down and crawled in the Martin's Ferry storm drains when we were kids. He told me we must be aware of the grandpa crab. It was enormous and fearsome and would eat us if we let it. Once it nearly caught us down there in those underground places, and I remember desperately scrambling up, vowing that wherever the grandpa crab caught me by the ass, it was not going to be in Ohio. This is the entry from the following day, also in Siena. One of the secrets I can most comfortably share in my notebook is my love of rain. Caught in city streets without coat or hat or umbrella, I see the other human beings giggling nervously or cursing their luck and skittering for cover under arches, awnings, umbrellas. And I'm afraid I skitter too, just to keep up appearances or maybe in hope of escaping recognition. But what I really feel, though I tell no one, is triumph for the dry weeds by the railroad tracks in Ohio, for the turtle in Sirmione who knows everyone else is gone and who would come naked out of his shell if he could, and for all the bony-faced sumacs who open their sticky red leaves and stink to their heart's content. So later in July, a couple weeks later, they're back in Venice, another favorite place of theirs. And this short little typed piece, he actually adds a title to by hand at the top. In Martin's Ferry. A long July afternoon and nothing to do but walk downhill, past the lumber company and across the abandoned mill field. On the side of the B&O track toward the river, the hobo jungle sang. The smooth green beetles chomping at something or other, and the speckled locusts cooling themselves upside down among narrow corridors of shade. How did the gently blue and gray flakes of the slag pile ever fall there like snow? For no mine pits opened nearby, only the Martin's Ferry sewer main, and far away on the Appalachian slope, the black mouth of the B&O tunnel. I walked across the terminal bridge and crept into the mouth, but nothing drank me, and I came out again unlived. So he's beginning to suspect that something might be wrong, and he's constantly exhausted at the end of that trip. They spend the final month of their stay in Europe, again at the Higgins's apartment. But even that was starting not to bring the joy that it once did. When James and Annie returned to New York in September and Wright resumed teaching at Hunter College, he was plagued by a sore throat and an overwhelming sense of exhaustion. The cancerous tumor at the base of his tongue would go undiagnosed for over 3 months. In the company of Dave Smith, who was here at the first festival in 1981, and Gibbons Ruark, who was here in 1983 and again in 2007, Wright recorded his final interview, which I quoted from earlier. It's a fascinating document, and during this long afternoon of talk, Wright admitted the peculiar kind of devotion that he felt towards Martin's Ferry and the complicated feelings the place still stirred up in him. He refused to use the term working class, preferring instead to speak of the working people he knew and admired in his hometown. Wright said the place brought to mind Virgil's use of the term imago, meaning presence. He spoke of the presiding genius of the place. And yet he agreed with his friend Tom Hodge that growing up there, our problem was how to get out of the Ohio Valley and Martin's Ferry. At the final poetry reading he gave 2 weeks later at Harvard University, Wright said, "I have a new book I've been working on in which I find myself going back to Ohio again and again with some affection. I've written kind of harshly about the place at times, and I have troubled some people in my hometown back in Martin's Ferry, Ohio. They thought I was just attacking the place. That wasn't it. It was, and is to me still, an important American place." It was extremely difficult coming to the end of the biography to read Wright's journals as he struggles with the knowledge of his illness, suspecting the severity of it, but still trying to retain some semblance of hope for the sake of Annie, for his students, and for the work he still needed to do to complete his last book. A biopsy was finally taken the day after Thanksgiving, but more than a week later, Wright's doctor had still not given them any conclusive diagnosis. Here is the complete entry Wright typed into his journal in New York on December 5th, 1979. It is Wednesday evening, and I still don't know flatly and finally how to write prose in a tangle of rusty barbed wire, lashing and whipping across a dead field and back again, all the feathers fallen out of the tanagers' nests, all the last groundhogs stirring over in their sleep, lifting their faces toward the old hopelessness and winter in Ohio, settling down, down the hill, down the river running down. Under my hands, the small stony turds of wild rabbits scatter and rattle like shot from shells all the way downhill in the dirty snow. M.E. Ketchum, the warden from Moundsville, throws his shadow and the shadows of all the silent and bleeding years back up the hill, where I sit in the wind, above the river, waiting for the wind to die down, waiting to go down to the river. They learned the next day of just how serious and inoperable his cancer was. So that was the last entry in his journal before he knew finally and flatly. The Moundsville Penitentiary stood 15 miles due south of Martin's Ferry on the West Virginia side of the Ohio River. M.E. Ketchum served as warden there from 1941 to 1946. How this particular name found its way into Wright's capacious memory is anyone's guess. I should add that this is not the source for Above the River, the title of Wright's complete poems, published in 1990. That phrase also appears in an earlier poem of his on a phrase from southern Ohio and was chosen as a title by Anne Wright. Wright entered the hospital 1 month to the day after this despairing journal entry. He spent 3 months in hospital and hospice care before he died on March 25th, 1980. A few days after he had died, Gladys Van Horn, who's been a frequent presence at this festival, wrote in the Wheeling News Register, Last Sunday afternoon, this is 2 days before Wright died. Last Sunday afternoon, the acclaimed writer lay gravely ill with cancer in New York City while a group listened to a reading of his poetry in the Martins Ferry Public Library. Most of the audience was unaware of his condition. The program had been arranged by the head librarian, John Stork, of New York City and Massillon, Ohio, as part of a series to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the library's founding. So this would have been in 1980. The discussion of Wright's life and the readings were done by Dr. Bernard Meredith, Associate Professor of Literature at West Liberty State College. But Van Horn made particular note of what James Wright's aunt, his father Dudley's sister Lillian Rensler, was part of this gathering. And she voiced very strongly that afternoon, nobody loved the town more than he did. He was a quiet boy. He often stood back and listened. At the very first James Wright Poetry Festival held in Martins Ferry on May 16, 1981, Robert Bly recalled the words of the minister at Wright's funeral. He moved to 4 different elementary schools as a child. He learned what injustice was, and he never forgot it. This remembrance by Bly was transcribed from Robert's first appearance at the festival, which was inspired in part by the marvelous librarian John Stork, who we have a great deal to thank. And Robert, of course, appeared at 3 different James Wright festivals, the first in 1981, again in 1991 with Galway Canal, and once more in 2000 at the 20th festival. Cannell was also here 3 times. Those of us who have had the pleasure of returning to Martins Ferry know what a blessing it is to hear poetry in this place once more, and how wonderful to look forward to a full day to become besotted again with poetry. Thank you.
Yeah.
5 minutes?
Yeah.
And is there if do you want to say why you came? I suggested a few reasons why we're here, but does anyone have any questions about the biography? Or you're certainly welcome to speak to me personally, and I'll be happy to sign books for you, and I'm glad to see everyone here.
How much did the first biography influence your work?
There was no first biography. You're speaking of Peter Stitt, I imagine.
Yeah.
He never wrote page 1 of his book. He never, there was nothing of his that goes into my book. Yeah, that was a great shame. He spent a great deal of time. I know he did a number of interviews, but I did not have access to that material. And he was on tour as the authorized biographer, yes. but he never actually wrote page 1. Yeah.
How much did Annie Wright contribute to your work?
You know, I actually counted the number of times I interviewed her, and that means, you know, talking on the phone I traveled with Annie. My family and I, my wife and daughter and I traveled in France and in Italy with her. And I had my recording gear, and every time we were in a new spot, I would say, so what do you remember about, you know, because actually physically being in these places would trigger memories for her of precise exchanges. She has a remarkable memory. And so I have close to 137 different kind of transcriptions of interviews that I did with her. Some of them many hours. But when I first interviewed her in 1990, she would say to me, well, James would sometimes have a little too much to drink. So it took many years before she was willing to accept that the only reason to write and publish a biography is to tell the full truth about the life. And that's the only reason to do it. And so it was a long time before she was willing to share some of the more difficult things. But she's a huge part. I mean, they were together traveling. That's the only source I have for so much of their time together, just the two of them.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yes, sure.
Yeah, I really, really appreciated your approach to place and kind of like the poetics of place. I don't know what you want to call it. And I wondered what your own process was. Did you visit all these places?
Absolutely.
And how did you get into the place? The places.
Oh,
Did you have like a way of doing that for yourself?
I was inventing a lot of strategies on the go, but I had to go to these places. I had to go to Fargo, North Dakota. You know, I had to knock on the door where they lived in Minneapolis, and the beginning of my book, I counted the 13 steps that went down to his basement. In the basement, you know, I mean, it's those kind of details were really important to me. And I should mention that I was influenced by a great romantic biographer by the name of Richard Holmes, one of the great living biographers. He and Robert Caro are probably the two greatest living biographers that we have. And Richard Holmes is a fabulous biographer. His biography of Coleridge is one of the great works of art. But he's also written a book on Shelley and a great many other writers. But it was his book. There's a book called Footsteps that he published that is really wonderful in its own right, and I fell under his sway. And his insistence was, you know, if you're a biographer, you have to physically walk where they walked, and you have to you know, that's part of your job. And certainly Robert Caro is another example of that. I mean, he went and lived in the town where Lyndon Johnson was born for months. You know, and it took that long for some people to be willing to talk to him. So that is part of the job, and that was some of the great fun of the job. Of course, traveling in France and Italy. I mean, some things you just have to bear up. You know, you know. Yeah.
So we want to thank you, Jonathan, for the
Thanks,
wonderful
David.
talk.
Sure. Yes. Thank you.